These are the most liked books by booktubers. I scoured a bunch of YouTube booktubers and I watched a bunch of their videos to see kind of what fell into their top 10, top 15, top 20, depending on the creator. This list was a little hard to put together because some creators did their lists vastly different than others. Some did top 10, some did 15, some did 20. Some people did top 10 but added an 11th. Other people just said it was a top 10 list, but then didn't really include any books in their top 10, just kind of used it as a title. Some people's most recent top 10s were truly their favorite fantasy books. Other people's top 10s were what they thought were the best fantasy books. And still another top 10 was currently what they enjoyed reading the most. So this is an amalgamation of all these lists to kind of boil it down to what is the most recommended, the most liked booktube books out there, what essentially all of them could practically agree on what they think you should read. Not every single one of them would agree with everything on this list, but again, there was a lot of different lists that I compiled this on. And one of the things I actually really came to enjoy about putting this list together is watching all these different booktubers and all their different book suggestions across all these different channels. You saw a lot of reoccurring themes from certain people, but then other people you saw very niche books that weren't super popular. I think by the time I was done with this list, I had close to 100+ different books on here that I had to whittle my way down to 10. Even then, with my 2 honorable mentions, there's still technically 15 books on this list, with a lot of ties in there based on the way I ranked them, based on how many times they were mentioned throughout all the different channels I went through, and based on if they were ranked and where they were placed in their rankings. This was really fun project to do, and I really enjoyed it, and I like watching other people's top 10 videos to see what books they put in there that nobody else seems to even recognize or think of. One of my personal favorites, Lycania's series, was only mentioned once from when I was looking through all of these, which is a bit of a bummer, but I can completely understand why it's not in a top 10 ultimate fantasy list. And even still, there were some surprises that certain books didn't do better than I thought they were going to do when I did this list. So there are some surprises in here and some not surprises in here as well. And so we're just going to jump right into here now that we've gotten that intro out of the way. And so we're going to start with these honorable mentions. The first honorable mention that we have is the Dandelion Dynasty. Unfortunately, this one didn't get mentioned as much as I kind of thought it would. It got mentioned more than other books, but it didn't get mentioned a whole lot, but it did pretty well in the rankings, way better than a lot of other books, and so it's still technically a top 15, but it's not the same as the others, so it falls into the honorable mentions. But I think it is worth mentioning because tons of people seem to enjoy this series. I personally haven't read it. It is on my to be read eventually, so I'm looking forward to reading it, but I can understand why it didn't fall into a top 10. This other honorable mention that I have really surprised me that it didn't make it into the top 10, despite how many times it was mentioned across all these booktubers' top 10, top 15, whatever it was. And so it really did surprise me that it didn't actually end up making it into the top 10. And this is Mistborn Era 1. I really enjoyed this series. I know a lot of other booktubers did as well. It's just the reason that I think it didn't end up in the top 10 is because there are so many loved series out there, and when you split this across so many different people, you find other trends elsewhere, and lots of people really like Brandon Sanderson, but when it comes down to it, it just didn't make it into the top 10. Now, starting it off at number 10, we already start things off a little strange. It's where we have 3 different series kind of falling in the top 10. At number 10, they all tied. They had the same amount of recommendations across all the booktubers that I watched total, and they all ended up with the same amount of points based on the system that I had. And so these 3 different series, we'll hit them all real quick, and it's no surprise that they're in the top 10, but it is a bit surprising that they're not higher up on this list. The first of the 3 at spot number 10 is Farseer Trilogy by Robin Hobb. I am itching to get into this series. I'm really close to picking up the first book. I haven't quite gotten to it yet. There's still quite a few things I got to read before I get to it, but I'm really excited to get into it. I know lots of people really enjoy this one, and so I'm excited to start it. The second thing that is on number 10, tied with this other one, is Kingkiller Chronicle. I'm a little surprised this one didn't make it into 9 or 8, but it's also not mentioned a ton by a lot of different people. I think it's because it's an unfinished series, it ends up not getting talked about as much. And because it's been so long since the last published book, it's kind of fallen off in the last few years. So I can understand why it didn't make it any higher, but I'm a little surprised. And the last series at number 10, the third one of these series that tied, is A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin. I know a lot of people really think this is a really good series, but I found that it wasn't put in a lot of people's top 10s. And again, I think it kind of ties in with Kingkiller Chronicle. It's unfinished. It's a big series. Not a lot of people commit to those kind of things. But I think more than that, it is unfinished. So that's why I think it ended up at number 10. But I'm a little surprised because of how much of a staple this is that it's not 7 or 6 in this list either. Now that we got that out of the way, we're going on to number 9. And number 9 is The Sword of Kagan. This book is written by M.L. Wang, and I don't know very much about this series, but the few people that talked about this book that really, really enjoyed it put it very highly on their lists, and this is why it kind of comes in at number 10, is for the people who enjoyed this, it ended up actually doing really well in their top 10 or top 20 or whatever it was, and that's why this kind of ended up at number 9 above those other series, is just because the people who enjoyed it really liked it. I have it in my to be read. I haven't gotten to it yet, but I am very excited to read this book. Coming in at number 8 is The Gentleman Bastards by Scott Lynch. This book is recommended a bunch. People really, really loved this series. I don't think it's finished. I'm excited to pick up the first one. I've heard it's an amazing story with amazing characters, and just each one is totally different and just so enjoyable to get into. So I'm really excited to pick this up. And if you already have picked this series up, let me know what you think about it, because I'm really excited to read it. Coming in at number 7 is Discworld. There are tons of these books, and while this is actually recommended less often than the previous series, The Gentleman Bastards, it's actually put higher on people's lists when I see it recommended. People love this series when they get into it. It's not recommended as often as some of the others, but people tend to really, really love this series. I'm excited to get into it because there's just so many of these books that I feel like I could just read this forever. And I think that's kind of one of the reasons so many people enjoy this series, is there's just so many different books to get into. Coming in just above that at number 6 is The Wheel of Time. It's no wonder this is on the list. There's tons of books. People really, really love this series. It's super popular. I mean, there's a whole show about it. And specifically, the book that's recommended the most or put in most people's top 10 is The Great Hunt. I've got it right behind me. It is just a staple in the fantasy world. It's no wonder it's on this list. I'm a little surprised it didn't do better. But I think because it's been around so long, it doesn't get recommended as much, kind of falling in the similar category as A Song of Ice and Fire and Kingkiller Chronicles, where it's talked about a lot. People know what it is. And so it's not recommended nearly as often as some of these other books. Coming in at number 5, and now I kind of knew nothing about this series. I haven't even read it yet before I got into booktubing and watching all these people talk about this book, and that book is Malazan at number 5. There are some people who have this in their top 3 and a couple that have it at number 1. People love this series and will die for it. It is amazing how much people really like this series, and which makes me super excited to get into it. If you've read this, let me know how it is. Should I read it sooner rather than later, or can I put it off? Let me know. There are some people that just absolutely love this book. Coming in at number 4, we have 2 that have actually tied for this spot, and the first one is Stormlight Archives by Brandon Sanderson. It's unfinished, but it is talked about all the time. It's not surprising that people have this on their top 10 list, and it's not surprising that booktubers really like it. There's plenty to talk about by Brandon Sanderson, and the series is supposed to be really, really big by the time it's done, so it's no wonder. I mean, even his second book, Words of Radiance, is, I think, top of the charts in fantasy on Goodreads, but I could be wrong. It could have been moved by then. This book is just loved by so many people. So that's the most recommended out of the Stormlight Archives, but the series as a whole is constantly put in people's top 10, usually top 3 to top 5, somewhere in there. I love this series. I totally understand it. He's got some of my favorite books in this series, so I totally understand why it's up there. I'd put it up there. In fact, I think I did put it up there in my top 10. Maybe I didn't make a top 10. It was my tier list. Beside the point, it's totally understandable why this is up there. The other series that is tied with Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight Archive up here is the Live Ship Trader Trilogy by Robin Hobb. She has 2 on this list, and if that does not speak wonders to how good of a writer she is, I don't know what else does. I think I'm the most excited about reading this series more than anything else she has written. I'm excited to get into the whole Elder Ring, the realm of Elderlings, I believe it's called. This is the one that I'm excited to get into more than any of the others. It's recommended way more than the others in the series. People love this trilogy, and that's why I'm excited to get into it. And so this list is kind of a why I'm excited to get into these books and kind of the most recommended booktubes, but not the point. The point is that this is at number 4 for good reason. People love it. We are now getting into the top 3, and these series are essentially mentioned all the time. Almost every single video I watched, these 3 series were brought up at one point or another, either just in the top 10, usually top 5 is where these ended up when people talked about them. And that's why they did really well on this list, is because they were talked about a lot, and when they were talked about a lot, they were placed really, really highly on people's lists. And so at number 3 is The First Law by Joe Abercrombie. People love, love, love how he writes characters. That is what I have gotten out of watching people talk about this series, is the characters and how well he writes them, which makes me so excited to get into this series at one point. There's just so many books to read. It's really hard to keep up with the world and how fast these are being published because people are so good at writing with so many different styles. Joe Abercrombie's talked about a lot, and this series specifically is what everybody seems to touch on, so it's no wonder that it's put on this list. It's mentioned everywhere. Coming in at number 2, and this book is kind of a no surprise to me, and I'd be surprised if you were surprised by this, and that is the Greenbone Saga by Fonda Lee. This book is talked about constantly in other booktubers' channels, constantly in top 3 or top 5 on these series that people are making. It's really no surprise that this is number 2. I've seen it mentioned in practically every video that I watched putting this video together. So many people really love this series. People love this raw mafia feel they get from the books and just how well written they are. And the storylines on these books I've heard is amazing. And that is why this is number 2 on the most recommended books I've found out there. And if you haven't guessed it yet, number 1 is Middle-earth / The Lord of the Rings. It's no wonder that this series is placed at number 1. Even though it's honestly not put in a lot of people's top 10s, it's usually an honorable mention. It is more mentioned than any other book I can find. It's not a very big surprise why J.R.R. Tolkien has the number 1 spot here. His books have been around longer than really any other fantasy out there, and they're going to continue to just last time. They're going to just continue to honestly never die. There is nothing that is going to dethrone The Lord of the Rings that I can see in terms of the most lasting series / books ever. In terms of fantasy, they're just going to last forever. They've got amazing movies to back them up. It makes total sense as to why this book trilogy is placed at number 1. Every booktuber talks about it at one point, and lots of them really, really love it. It's pretty rare that you find somebody who didn't really enjoy Lord of the Rings either when they were younger or more recently. Occasionally you find somebody who's like, it wasn't for me, but it's no surprise. It's talked about all the time. That is the 10 most recommended / talked about books I could find on booktuber channels. What are you surprised about on this list? Were the ones that you thought should be on here that were missing? People haven't been talking about enough. There were so many books to filter through here to get to this point, so it would make sense that others also deserve to be on this list, being that there were so many ties, but these just happened to boil up onto top once you really got rid of everything else that weren't recommended nearly as much. I'm excited to see how this list changes over the years and people start reading other things and finishing series and start recommending other books. I'm curious to see what gets taken off this list and what stays. It's really going to be interesting to see how BookTube changes over the years because I want to make this list kind of frequently. The problem is not everybody makes top 10s consistently, and when they do, lots of the same books are on them, so that makes sense. We can't update this list very often, but when we do, I'm very curious to see what changes. I think Mistborn not being in the top 10 was the most surprising for me. While it's talked about a lot, it's usually in honorable mentions or low on people's lists, and I kind of think that's why it didn't end up in the top 10 compared to these others. But it's there, and I'm glad it was there. That was my most surprising thing about this list. What was your most surprising thing? Let me know what's missing from this list. But for now, put the video down and go pick up a book.